Well, here's the question. Do you want to teach your children to think? Many people have come to me and they say, how can I teach my child to think more clearly? And how can I teach him to concentrate on projects and on reading and on organizing his thoughts in such a way that will be useful to him both in life and in school? And usually you get either the overcharged yuppie parent who already dreams of their 4-year-old graduating from Princeton or Chicago, or you get the desperate parent of the teenager who thinks the kid's never going to learn or do anything, and is there some mystical kind of thing I can add and mix, and the kid will start doing something other than video games or naps. Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I've said many times, the key to it all is curiosity. And it might have killed the cat, but it brings to life our interest and our mental capacity in almost any field that we could possibly conceive of. So, I mean, it's obvious to me, and I'm sure you know this, that we only know about the things and remember about the things we're interested in, with the possible exception of some narrow academic things we have to learn in order to succeed at school or on a test. And even those things disappear from our mind within a year after the test, usually, because they had no place except in the test. They didn't have any place in our imagination. They didn't have any place in our general way of thinking or in our curious connection to the objects of thought. Now, what do I mean by our curious connection to the objects of thought? Well, most little kids, most boys and girls who you see out at the mall or walking down in your neighborhood street or at church or wherever you happen to see a child who's 5, 6, 7, 8, most of those children are marked by a much greater curiosity and energy about new things than their parents have. The parents by that time have now been dealt the terrible mortal blow of practical life, and they're doing their job and making ends meet and paying for their car and orthodontist work and, all kinds of issues of, can we pay for the vacation? Can we live in a house of this size? Can we compete with our neighbors? Can we survive in our community? Can we give support to the church? And all this has monetary and it becomes a crushing set of forces that seem to move the mind away from its natural curiosity, its interest in objects which are beautiful or novel or intrinsically complex or whatever could be their attraction. It moves them away, and suddenly we're just in a complex of things that just produce an end, and that end is kind of balance of life or a kind of economy in which we can have comfort. And an economy in which we can have comfort is not an atmosphere in which we find a great deal of knowledge and insight. Now, having said that, the kids that are 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 out at the mall who are being yelled at to their parents to sit still and not drop their French fry and quit making noise and shut up and all the other, not that these are terrible crimes to say to your child, because I'm sure children drive adults mad and very commonly. But those children, if you just observe them as an outsider, and I'm a classic outsider as being a bachelor and being somebody who sees them as kind of representative beings rather than family problems. So I noticed that these kids have enormous curiosity. One of the most predominating things they say is, "What's that?" and "What's that?" and "Why is he doing that, Mommy?" and "Where is that going?" and "Could we see over there?" or "Could we do that?" Now, some of it is buying toys and, the normal appetite of kids, but a lot of it is just pure unmoored, unorganized curiosity. And the question the parent has to ask him or herself is, can I organize this curiosity? Can I possibly get this curiosity domesticated enough so that it's useful to the kid and it's not blunted too soon at the age of 12 or 14 or whatever. It's not blunted too soon so that growth of knowledge, which would include expertise and knowledge in science and law and in medicine in spiritual matter, whatever, all these will be lost to the kid because they will have no habit of intellectual curiosity. What can I do? What can I do to save them now so they don't become one of these inert and passive beings when they're a young adult? And pass that on to the next generation, it becomes a kind of prison of indifference at some level. And what do I do? Because a lot of parents, God bless them, do see in their children enormous capacities, which either they remember they had at one time and have lost, or that they had and have gained from having. In other words, they grew in their own mental powers and they want their children to do the same, one or the other of those states. And in either case, they long to have their children at home in the world and interested in the world as it presents itself, this massive, complicated creation, physical creation, social creation, human nature, the nature of other living and non-living objects. This is a massive field meant, it seems, to entertain and instruct humans. So, well, my parents were almost famous among their peers and among their little group of professionals, as my father was an attorney, for having somehow built an edifice in my brother's life and in my own, in a different way in my sister's life, an edifice which would somehow spur us on to more and more abstract and remarkable connections to bodies of knowledge and objects. So my brother was very interested in minerals, and then he was very interested in seashells and in birds, maps, and butterflies, and he collected and he named them and he studied them and he internalized all kinds of information, and he became a very important and famous field scientist, one of the most famous and legendary of the 20th century, still talked about among ornithologists and ecologists. I, on the other hand, had some of these interests. I early on, through my brother's example, I was pursuing interest in reptiles and amphibians, other animals, then American history, world history to some extent, poetry, and sports, and branching fields of all kinds, until I became thought of as a kind of, bank in which information could be stored. And how this happened, I won't fully describe today, but it happened by a self-conscious and intuitively brilliant scheme that my parents devised for us to pursue more and more tasks that would embolden our minds and our interests and our thoughts. And they also threw away, I think, I know my father did, because he said to me very seriously one time, it's not good to teach a child to be practical unless they have to be. And that's a matter of their practical situation. But if they don't have to be practical up to the college days, and even in college days, they should be let go, because in America, everybody works. And almost everybody works for 40 or 50 years or more. And it's not a real great distinction at work, although we say I'm a welder, I'm a preacher, I'm a professor, I'm a bus driver. And we define ourselves largely in America more than elsewhere by our job. And so work is very important. But my father's point was, aside from street people and people who have deficits, or people who have social limitations, like the ghetto or something, which is a cultural phenomenon, very complex, aside from those people, most everybody works most of their life, if not all of their life. So obviously it isn't very hard to do. Now, but the question is, when you work, are you going to be interested in it? Are you going to get any more out of it than just survival in a practical or pragmatic sense? And so my father used to say, even though he had worked on the turnpike to go to law school and all through high school before he went to the Marine Corps, he'd done nothing but work. He thought he was a very strange character in that although he had sacrificed so much of the time of his own personal interests as a young man, he believed that my brother and I should, while we could, up to a certain age, pursue these interests of ours without any limitation whatsoever. Now, it is true that when we reached our early 20s, he told us, now you're on your own, no more money, no more support. I've supported you all these years. I've given you direction. I've fulfilled, and that was in. So there were two sides to it. But I'm going to exemplify this question of curiosity in one simple way, which is going to sound very strange to people out there listening. I'm going to talk about something that had a most profound effect on my mental organization, and that was learning the Linnaean System. Now let me explain that. Linnaeus was an 18th century biologist, and he invented the field of taxonomy. Taxonomy means the organized naming of objects in a field. And what he invented the naming of was animals and plants. Although his three-part structure was animal, plant, mineral. He included mineral as part of his structure of existence as he understood it. That mineral part later kind of fell out of the Linnaean tradition because Linnaeus's real influence was on biology. And so what is this? What did he do? What did he invent? Why is this possibly important? Well, the Linnaean system is a system which gave a hierarchy of categories to the understanding of animals and plants. In my experience, it was important in my learning about animals because I never did a thorough and rigorous job of organizing my thoughts about plants. That's a much more complicated subject in a lot of ways because the relation of plants to each other is not so visibly obvious as it is with animals. So Linnaeus decided that the biggest category you could have is a kingdom. And a kingdom, in his mind, he was a religious person, so God was the king of the kingdom, and the kingdoms of existence were animal, vegetable, and mineral, and everything in the created order was in one of those categories. And so its largest categorical name in this taxonomy, this organizing system, was kingdom. Now, the second kingdom, Animalia, included all the creatures capable of motion and capable of visible vivacity, as he said, a living motion. And that's what an animal is, an animal, a creature that can move. Now, some creatures barely move, like coral, but a coral is an animal. And some animals move, a cheetah moves enormously and speedily. So there's an enormous variety of motions from high to low in the animal kingdom. But they all share that they don't simply grow like a plant. A plant grows from its place, its spot, and then through photosynthesis it takes in light and water and does this complex chemical activity to survive. The animals don't do that. They do something to procure their food, their diet, and they are therefore mobile living beings, even if they're sea cucumbers or sand dollars or some very simple creature. Now, so what was the big deal? Well, my brother came to me and said, I've learned the names of all the birds in the United States, which is a gigantic number, by the way. And he was about, 12 or 13 then. And I know them, and I've learned their Latin names, which are their real names. Now, this is a very strange distinction. Something's real name. But what he meant by that was the name that scientists agree on when they want to distinguish one bird from another. And he said, you should do this for reptiles and amphibians, starting with North America, and certainly the ones that we've seen in Lancaster. I was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Certainly the ones in the northeast United States, and then go out until you know. So you're going to have to get your field guide and your various texts, And you're going to have to learn the Latin names because they're the real names. They're the names scientists use and that, so that they definitively can tell which animal they're talking about or looking at. Because after all, some people call the mud puppy the water eel, and some people call the hognose snake the country fat snake or something. And there's names everywhere. And if you look in guides of reptiles and amphibians or birds, you'll see that they have numerous names. Some popular, some quasi-scientific, and some just local. So forget that and learn And he said, in order to do that, here's your chart. And he gave me a chart of the Linnaean system. And so I thought, say I was doing, and I'll represent this to you by the spotted salamander, one of my favorite of all the reptiles and amphibians that live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's a large 8 or 9 inch salamander with a thick body and bright iridescent yellow spots, which only comes out for 4 or 5 days out of the year. And we used to go out during those days to capture them because they were such magnificent creatures and so secretive. So let's say I was thinking back in those days when I was 10 or 11 about the spotted salamander. Well, first of all, it was an animal, so it was Animalia. That's obvious. Its phylum, which is the next level, was that it was chordata. It had a backbone. There's a huge number of animals with a backbone, and there's an even larger number of animals without a backbone. Obviously, the mollusks and the worms and the coelenterates they don't have backbones. But the more developed animals, the animals on the other end of the evolutionary chain, starting with fish, have a backbone. They all have it. And that backbone is an archetypal part of the design of these later animals. And it's one of the things that makes them, for example, symmetrical, having a right and left side, because the backbone is a dividing element in their structure. So fish and salamanders and snakes and lizards and toads and all mammals and birds all have this quality of the backbone that makes a symmetrical structure of being, and gives the fundamental evolutionary ground for right and left, the right and left eye, the right and left ear, the symmetrical tools of sensation. There's even right and left in the sensations and control of the muscular body, like in the ribs. They even have an independent. And this is all a function of this quality chordata, having a backbone, a central backbone. And that backbone usually houses the cord or lifeline of the central nervous system, the spinal cord, which connects the brain to all these other movable parts of the body. So chordata. So my spotted salamander is a chordate. It has a backbone. Then I have to ask myself, what class of animals is it in? And the answer to that is amphibia. Amphibia. And that, of course, means amphibians, animals that live both amphi, in water and land. They're semi-aquatic. Some more or less aquatic and others more or less terrestrial, but all having at least one phase of their life completely aquatic, the larval phase. There's many other qualities that determine the amphibious life, but the amphibian is a moist, cold-bodied, symmetrical chordate. And so this was a perfect description, of course, of the spotted salamander. Spotted salamander is symmetrical, it's cool into the touch, it's moist in its skin, it has vast mucous membranes on the surface to keep it moist. It must live close to or in water in order to survive, which is true of amphibians. It breeds in the water and comes out and walks on the land only in its adult form. These are the qualities of an amphibian. And I can observe in my spotted salamander these universal amphibian qualities, okay? But now I get into a smaller category. What order is it in? When I was a kid, the order was Salamandridae, and that has been changed because of physiological analysis of the amphibians' relation to reptiles, and they're now called the Uladarata. And because we now know that what we used to think of their relation to the other chordates was wrong. We made genetico-specific errors about amphibian nature, and I can't explain it to you today, and that would take a whole lecture. But so that new name is what we now call the order. That is the subgroup under the class that distinguishes amphibians from the other salamanders from the other amphibians. So salamanders are different than toads, frogs, and the amphiuma and other odd newts and other odd amphibian creatures. Then we get to family. And the family is a pretty small category. The family is all the genera, all the very local, particularly intimately connected groups that are in appearance similar, but may or may not be able to breed together. They may or may not be able to have fertile breeding patterns. So the family that the spotted salamander in is Ambystomyidae. And there's a lot of North American and some other parts of the world salamanders that look like it and are obviously connected to it, but only a smaller group can interbreed with it in its own genus, or has a close genetic relation to it, even if it only breeds commonly with its own very narrow species. And that's the genus, probably the most important of all these categories for analyzing the particular animal, the genus, which is Ambystoma. The Ambystoma are the mole salamanders. They're called mole salamanders because they dig into bark of trees or under rocks or deep under the earth almost all the months of the year, and they have a shovel-like front of their head to make this possible. And the mole salamanders disappear into the earth except for that 1 week of reproduction. And therefore, although they're among the largest salamanders in the world, they're also among the most secretive. So the mole salamanders include a lot of the most beautiful and interesting salamanders I ever saw in my life: the marbled salamander, the Jeffersons, the tiger, the Mabie salamander, and the marbles. Nothing more, though, more beautiful and more extraordinary than the spotted salamander. So the genus of the spotted salamander, Ambystoma, now needs a specific name to connect to it to describe this narrow, exact species, the spotted form, inside this genus, and that's maculatum, which means spotted in Latin. Ambystoma maculatum. That's the name that I can use. But if I understand that name connects this beautiful little salamander, which I've had the experience of and which I have a curious interest in, if I can see it connects it to all the members of its genus, the Jefferson salamander, the tiger salamander, the marbled salamander, if I can also see its family, which is a slightly larger group of similar appearance, if I can see how it connects to its order, which is all the other salamanders, how it's thicker than some, more terrestrial than others, has a different habitat than some, but I can distinguish it that way from other salamanders. And because I go down, how can I distinguish from other amphibians? How can I distinguish it from other chordates, which is on a very massive scale? How can I distinguish it from all the other animals? Now, if I can do this process when I'm 10 or 11 years old, I have put myself unconsciously, only because my brother said I should do it, I have put myself through a rigorous and complicated logical training. I have organized names of a simple creature that I've seen into an 8 or 9-fold pattern, which each level which distinguishes a category which is complicated in itself. Each of these levels is complicated. And as I got older, I read more about the nature of classes and orders and genera, and I got more and more interested in the details of this whole structure. And from that, one is introduced not only to zoology, but also to evolutionary theory. Just through this naming process alone, it's an aperture or a doorway to enormous insight. And you know the real name, and that a child can prize knowing the real name shared by scientists, people he aspires to be like, who have real understanding and knowledge, and not simply a common understanding, the unprincipled understanding, the non-scientific understanding. And this meant a lot to a child. And then it was Latin, and it was almost my introduction to Latin. So all these together were of enormous significance, and I suggest this as a possibility for your children.